This is the LG G7 ThinQ. Yes, the name may sound kinda silly, but the phone itself is one of the best out there right now. I've been using it for quite some time, so let me tell you what makes it special. First off, the LG G7 looks and feels like a proper 2018 flagship smartphone. There's that shiny and super fancy Gorilla Glass 5 on both the front and the back. The blue and the rose colors look lovely, especially when the metal frame and buttons are painted to match. And yes, the phone is IP68 water resistant, so it can survive spills and can be safely used in the rain. But at the same time, the LG G7 doesn't look all that different from many of its competitors. The design could have been more original to make it stand out better. By now you may have noticed that the LG G7 is a very large smartphone. Using it with one hand can be a challenge at times, which is why I enabled this button here to pull down my list of notifications more easily. And speaking of buttons, this is the power key on the right. It isn't placed at the back anymore as it was on the G6 and the V30. This here below the camera is just a fingerprint reader. It is reliable and easy to reach, but it would have been nice if it supported gesture controls, like the ones that we have on the Google Pixel. On the left side of the G7 we find a button dedicated to accessing the Google Assistant. Press it once and the dialog screen appears. Press it twice and you get Google Lens, which can recognize objects and landmarks. You can even use the Assistant in walkie-talkie mode. Just hold down, speak and release. There is no need for the OK Google hot word. Overall, having this button is convenient, and I found myself using the Google Assistant more often because of it. Accidental presses do happen, but they're a lot less common than they are on the Galaxy S9 with its Bixby button. Now let's talk about the notch at the top of the display. It houses the earpiece, the front camera and a bunch of sensors, while the screen area on the sides is populated by the clock and your notification icons. I know that some would call this design unsightly, but honestly I stopped paying attention to it very soon after I started using the G7. The notch just doesn't get in the way of anything, and it actually frees up display area by moving the status bar up by a few millimeters. If you don't like the notch, you can kind of hide it by applying a background to the screen area on the sides. Personally, I chose not to. The display itself is very detailed thanks to its high resolution and produces very saturated colors. It is also the largest on a G-series smartphone so far. Even with the on-screen buttons, there is plenty of space for apps, games and videos. As with the G6 and the V30, playback of HDR content is supported. But above all, the screen gets very bright. In fact, it is the brightest that we've ever tested, as it is capable of reaching 1000 nits of output. Because of this, outdoor visibility has never been an issue during our testing. But there is a catch. The G7 won't maintain peak brightness for more than a few minutes, as it draws a lot of power and generates a lot of heat. Also, colors don't look great at peak brightness. Actually, even at normal brightness, colors appear kind of bluish, but we have a ton of display settings that can fix this. Personally, I've been using the screen with the Comfort View blue light filter enabled all the time. The LG G7 comes running Android 8.0 Oreo out of the box. LG has customized the software quite heavily, but if you've been using a recent LG phone, then you would find it all very familiar. By default, you won't find an app drawer here. All applications are placed on the home screen instead. You have an always-on display that shows you the time and lets you control things like music playback from standby. The floating bar from the LG V30, which you can slide out from any screen, lets you have quick shortcuts to apps and features. The on-screen buttons can be rearranged the way you like them, and the on-screen keyboard can be resized to fit you better. All in all, there is a lot of features packed inside the G7, and many of them can be really nice having in day-to-day use. However, there is one aspect of the G7 that didn't manage to impress me. This phone is supposed to have artificial intelligence built into it for user convenience, but I didn't see much of it. Sure, that Google Assistant button is nice having, and the camera has an AI mode that we're going to take a look at in a bit, but overall, the G7 doesn't bring any groundbreaking AI features to give meaning to the ThinQ branding. Leaving AI aside, the LG G7 is a very capable phone. It has the latest Snapdragon 845 chip and lots of memory, so day-to-day performance is nearly flawless. benchmark scores are impressive, and I've been playing some pretty intense games on the G7 without issues. For those who need it, a microSD memory card slot is still available. Moving on to the camera part, here's one of the best things about the G7, the dual camera at the back. The main camera is pretty standard. It has 16 megapixels of resolution and extras like optical image stabilization. The secondary camera uses the same 16 megapixel sensor, but it has a wide-angle lens. This gives it a much wider field of view, which allows you to capture more without having to step back. On the downside, the wide-angle camera does add a bit of distortion to the image, and it isn't very sensitive to light, so low-light images don't always look great. As for that main camera, it can definitely take some nice photos. If given enough light, its performance is right up there with the rest of the high-end smartphones of today. Unfortunately, there's a noticeable drop in quality when shooting in low light. Night shots are usable, but they aren't as good as what you'd get from some other high-end phones. There is a new super bright mode that combines information from 4 pixels into 1 for better sensitivity, but again, even though the images this mode produces are good enough for sharing on social media, overall they do not impress. The new portrait mode, on the other hand, works really well. It adds artistic blur to the background of your photos, giving them a more professional look. It is available on the front-facing camera as well, so you can take portrait selfies. Speaking of selfies, the front camera is a pretty average 8 megapixel shooter. Again, photos look okay in good light, but not great in darker surroundings. At least you can use the bright display as a flash, and the gestures you can use to trigger the camera are convenient. Now let me show you how the new AI camera mode works. By default, it isn't enabled, so you have to turn it on, and then it will attempt to recognize the objects that are inside your frame. The software has almost 20 scene presets and it can recognize over 1,000 objects. For example, it can tell if you're taking a picture of your pet, of a meal, or a picture of a sunset. It adjusts the camera settings based on what it sees, and hopefully you end up with a better photo. Unfortunately, photos taken by the AI don't necessarily look better. Pictures of food and flowers do look nicer since the software makes colors more saturated. But certain sceneries or objects that are naturally very colorful may end up looking artificial. You cannot undo the filtering done by the AI after the fact, and the mode makes the whole camera app slower, which is why I never really used the AI camera except for testing purposes. Finally, you can take videos with the G7 at up to 4K resolution with either the main or the wide-angle camera. Videos do look great, and autofocusing is usually very fast, but you cannot switch between the main and the wide-angle camera while shooting, which is weird since both the V30 and the G6 could do that. Another thing to note is that image stabilization is a lot more effective when taking 1080p video, but not as much when shooting in 4K. One thing that makes the LG G7 stand out is the unconventional speaker design. There is still a single bottom-firing speaker, but it is now bigger and it uses the whole internal volume of the phone as a resonance chamber. Vibrations travel along the entire back of the phone, which is why placing it on a flat, solid surface amplifies the sound significantly. This makes for one very loud alarm clock. Unfortunately, you don't get this effect while holding the phone in your hand, but even in this situation, the G7 sounds loud enough. The 3.5mm headphone jack is still here, so you can use your wired earphones with the G7 if you want to. You also get the powerful quad DAC from the G7 and the V30, meaning that the G7 can power large audiophile-grade headphones without issues. And lastly, battery life with the G7 has been okay throughout my testing. Neither bad nor exceptional in any way. With its 3000 mAh battery, the phone can get me through a day of typical use, and that's the kind of experience most people can expect out of it. To get better battery life out of the G7, you should avoid using it on high brightness for too long, and consider disabling the always-on display feature. A full charge with the stock charger takes 1 hour and 47 minutes, which is reasonably fast. In conclusion, the G7 is another well-made LG smartphone that has a lot to offer. It has both the specs and the looks that you would expect out of a flagship in 2018, and at $750 it is not overly expensive either. Too bad that it may end up overshadowed by the competition anyway. It feels like LG is putting too much emphasis on artificial intelligence when promoting the G7, while in reality its AI features fail to impress. Features like the dual camera, the bright display, and the loudspeaker are much more solid reasons to pick the G7 over any other phone on the market. And if you do, I don't think that you would be disappointed. Thanks for watching, guys. As always, you can learn a lot more about the LG G7 by visiting our website PhoneArena.com, and to never miss a video, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel.